Welcome to the recorded version of Addressing Health Disparities in People Living with Dementia from July 31st, 2018, part of the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series, sponsored by the Administration for Community Living.
Thanks so much, Steve. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar today on health disparities in people living with and at risk for dementia. In this webinar series, the Administration for Community Living's National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center has partnered with the American Society on Aging. We're pleased to have all of you in attendance today. Before we start with introductions of the speakers, Erin Long of the Administration for Community Living will provide a brief welcome. Erin?
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to welcome you and thank you for attending the webinar. We at the Administration on Aging and the Administration for Community Living feel that all of the topics that we are presenting to you through this webinar series are extremely important, and we hope that you agree with us. So I would like to thank Lisa Barnes and Andrea Garr for sharing their time with us and their knowledge, and look forward to fruitful interaction through the webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Erin. So today, as you heard, we'll hear from Dr. Lisa Barnes and Andrea Garr. Dr. Barnes is a cognitive neuropsychologist at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center and a professor of neurological sciences and behavioral sciences, both at Rush University in Chicago, Illinois. She is principal investigator of 3 community-based cohort studies of older African Americans and directs the Rush Center of Excellence on Disparities in HIV and Aging. Ms. Garr is a dementia specialist with professional expertise as a direct service provider, researcher, and diagnostic screener. She's a contributor and collaborator in strategic planning for and efforts to build a dementia-friendly and dementia-capable Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. So I will turn it over to both our presenters to begin our presentations today. Lisa and Andrea, take it away.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is Lisa Barnes. I'd like to thank the sponsors for organizing this webinar and thank you all for your interest in learning more about African Americans with and at risk for Alzheimer's dementia. For my section of the webinar, I will provide a brief description of our current understanding of racial disparities in Alzheimer's disease, which will be abbreviated as AD in the rest of my slides. I will then discuss a research program that I've been conducting since 2004 called the Minority Aging Research Study, also known as MARS. The goal of MARS is to identify risk factors for Alzheimer's dementia and cognitive decline in older African Americans. I will spend the latter half of my presentation describing selected findings from the study to illustrate some of the risk factors that we are finding may play a role in the disease for this population. So as you all know, the demographic profile of our nation is becoming increasingly diverse. This slide shows data from the U.S. Census with population projections from 2050 for different racial and ethnic groups. And what you can see is that minorities will make up the largest segment of the adult U.S. population in 2050. The different colors on the chart represent the different racial and ethnic groups, and you can see if you look at 2015, whites made up about 62.4% of the population, but that percentage will drop to 46.3% by 2050. African Americans, on the other hand, will increase from 13.8% in 2015 to 15% in 2050. Latinos will have the most dramatic increases. This demographic shift is important because minority populations, African Americans and Latinos in particular, are disproportionately burdened by Alzheimer's and cognitive impairment. In fact, the Alzheimer's Association estimates that African Americans are about 2 times more likely than whites to have Alzheimer's disease. And there's also data that indicates that they are less likely to receive medications for dementia when they're diagnosed. The data for the increased risk comes from a couple of large population-based studies. One is illustrated on this slide, and it comes from a study called YCAP, the Washington Heights Inwood Community Aging Project, which is run out of Columbia University in New York. What you can see is they've categorized people into 3 different racial ethnic groups: whites, African Americans, and Hispanic, and 3 age groups. And at every age category, African Americans and Latinos, shown in the greenish and blue bars, have a higher proportion of persons with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. Now, there's more recent data out of Kaiser, a large managed care consortium based in Oakland, California. They looked at dementia incidents from January 2000 to December 2013 in over 270,000 healthcare members over the age of 64. And they showed a similar pattern, with African Americans having a higher incidence of dementia, shown here in the purple dotted line, than any other racial ethnic group. Now, these 2 studies represent our best knowledge of the higher risk for African Americans when it comes to dementia, and there have been several studies showing the same finding. But there are challenges in interpreting this higher risk. The way that we typically make the diagnosis in the clinic is heavily reliant on performance on neuropsychological tests. Persons are generally given a comprehensive battery that measures a number of different domains of cognitive function, and performance on these tests determines whether or not you have impairment. But we know from many cognitive aging studies that older racial and ethnic minorities tend to perform at lower levels on these cognitive function tests on average compared to older non-Hispanic whites. And we also know that performance is influenced by multiple cultural and social attributes outside of cognition itself. And I've listed them here on the slide. So things like quality of education, language, early life factors, and so on. These factors are associated with race and ethnicity, and they can profoundly impact how people perform on these tests. So this, as you can well imagine, would present challenges for interpreting low performance, because it wouldn't be clear if low performance is due to the disease or because of some of these other factors that we know vary by race and ethnicity. One way to get around this challenge is to use longitudinal designs in which you examine a person repeatedly over time. This is a strong approach in studying health disparities because it allows you to gain a reliable estimate of change in cognitive function over time. And since aging is fundamentally a process of change over time, it makes sense to use a study design where you can actually measure the aging process. Another important design feature is when you use a longitudinal design, you're able to control and hold constant the level of function that a person starts with, so that all those factors I showed you on the previous slide, those factors are constant every time you see the person, and they are less likely to affect performance. Essentially, a person serves as his or her own control. So what you're doing is you're measuring how a person changes over time based on where they started, rather than comparing people that might vary on any of those characteristics. You're comparing a person to themselves, to where they started. So what we've done in our research at Rush is to use this kind of design to identify risk factors that influence how fast or how slow someone is changing over time. Ultimately, what we really want to be able to do is to prevent people from getting Alzheimer's. Prevention is thus a key goal of the research that we do in our studies, and the longitudinal design is one of the approaches that we use to do this. So if you think about it, and using this design, what we aim to do is to identify factors, shown in the green box, risk factors, either genetic or lifestyle factors, that may increase or decrease your risk of disease. We follow people over time, and then we try to determine the biologic pathways within the brain that link the risk factors to the disease. In this way, we're able to develop strategies to prevent Alzheimer's disease either by altering life behaviors. So, for example, if we find that lack of physical activity is a risk factor, we can have people increase their physical activity to protect them. Or we can identify druggable targets to develop effective therapeutics. For example, we might find that high blood pressure is a risk factor. Then we can treat the high blood pressure to reduce the risk of dementia. Now, of course, the disease is not that simple, but this gives you an idea of the utility of using this kind of a design to identify risk factors that may ultimately help us prevent the disease. Now, we have a number of studies at Rush where we use this kind of design, but for the purposes of the webinar today, I will focus on findings from one of those studies, the one I told you about, MARS, and another study of whites called the Rush Memory and Aging Project. And these two studies have the same design so that we can compare findings across race. So the first study, MARS, began recruitment in August 2004. It consists of over 750 African Americans. It is predominantly women, and people are over the age of 65 when they start. Participants are recruited from churches, senior buildings, and organizations in the metropolitan Chicago area. Most people come from the city, but some come from the suburbs as well. They are invited to join if they have no known dementia, meaning that a doctor has never diagnosed them with dementia and they're not taking medications for dementia. All participants receive an annual evaluation in their home consisting of cognitive testing, risk factor assessment, and everyone donates blood for genetic testing. The follow-up rate has been very good with greater than 92% among survivors, and we have up to 14 years of follow-up in people who started the study in 2004 and are still alive. Over time, about 5% have developed Alzheimer's dementia, because remember, when people start, they don't have any dementia, and about 18% have developed mild cognitive impairment. In 2011, we started to recruit for brain donation for autopsy because currently the most definitive way to know that the diagnosis is Alzheimer's disease is to actually look at the brain under a microscope after death. And we have very little data on what the underlying disease looks like in minority populations. So we started to recruit for autopsy a few years ago, and it's an optional component. People don't have to do it, but we have had about 345 people agree to donate their brain when they die. And we have 79 brains from African Americans so far across the different studies in our center. The other study that we use to compare and look across race is the Memory and Aging Project. This study started earlier in 1997 and consists of over 2,100 older people, again without dementia, from across northeastern Illinois counties. They also all agreed to annual clinical evaluations in their homes and annual blood donation. But in contrast to MARS, this study has a requirement that everyone has to agree to donate their brain, spinal cord, muscle, and nerve at the time of death. And that study has about 800 autopsies. But it's predominantly white, about 93% non-Hispanic white. And so, but the data are very similar across the studies, and we use the same cognitive battery so that we can merge the two studies to look at issues across race. So just to give you an idea of what we look at, here I'm showing you data from these two studies where we're comparing African Americans and whites on change in cognitive function over time. There are two panels represented. The top shows performance on semantic memory tests, which is memory for knowledge and facts, and the bottom panel shows performance on perceptual speed tests. On the horizontal axis, we've plotted age of the participants, people who started the study around 60 all the way up to age 90, and the length of the line shows you how long we followed people, so for about 5 years on this graph. On the vertical axis, there's performance on the test, with positive scores reflecting better performance and negative scores reflecting poorer performance. And what you can see is that there are two sets of lines on each panel. The green line on top are data from the whites, and the blue lines on the bottom are data from the African Americans. this graph shows you that whites are performing better than African Americans. But if you look at the slopes of the lines are parallel for the green and the blue lines, indicating that there's no difference in how fast people are declining over time. African Americans and whites are declining at the same rate, except if you go all the way to the right side of the graph in the upper ages, around 90, it looks like African Americans are actually declining slower. Their slope is less steep. And this is true for both semantic memory and perceptual speed. Now, we've shown the same thing in a population-based study called the Chicago Health and Aging Project, which is a study where we invited all of the residents in 3 neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago to participate in the study, and we had about 10,000 people agree to participate. In this graph, what we're showing you is data from the African Americans and whites again, and there's 3 panels: people who started the study at age 68 and were followed over time, people who started at age 73, and people who started at age 78. The whites are the top lines in each panel, the solid lines, and the dotted lines on the bottom are the data from the African Americans. And what you can see is that whites are performing at a higher level on our measure of cognition, but the lines are parallel over time. The lines represent change over time as we follow people, from age 65 and on. And so the lines are sloping down for everyone, meaning that everyone's getting worse with age. But because they're parallel, it suggests that African Americans are not declining any faster than whites, even though they start off at a lower level. So what these data are showing us is that the disparities in cognition in Alzheimer's disease that we see and that have been reported in the literature are mostly seen for level where people start, but not really so much when you look at change over time. So the next question becomes, can we identify risk factors that may be important in explaining these level differences, and can we identify risk factors that may slow the rate of decline so that people don't decline to a level where they are diagnosed with the disease? In our studies, we have found that some risk factors appear to operate the same across race. In this slide, I'm showing you factors that either decrease your risk of decline or disease, and on the right, those are factors that increase your risk of decline or the disease. These factors operate the same in African Americans and whites, and I'm not going to spend any time going over them in detail. These factors, on the other hand, appear to operate differently across race. There are some on the left-hand side that decrease the risk of decline or Alzheimer's disease in whites, but not blacks, like social engagement and physical activity, and there are others that seem to increase the risk in whites, but not blacks, shown on the other side of the panel. In the interest of time, I want to just run through a few examples of risk factors that are important in African Americans. The first is body mass index. You might also know this as BMI, a common metric that is used to categorize levels of obesity. We have shown that lower BMI in old age is related to a faster rate of cognitive decline. So this slide shows you change over time during the study period for people at different levels of BMI. The dotted line on the top are people who had the highest level of BMI, and the solid line on the bottom is people at the lowest level of BMI. And you can see that people at the lowest level have the steepest slope, meaning that they're declining at a faster rate than those with higher BMI levels. Now, if you look at these data separated by race, you see the same patterns that I just showed you. So there's 6 lines on here. The first 3 lines at the top are data from the whites, and the 3 lines right underneath are data from the African Americans. And what you see is that in both races, if you have a low BMI, you have a faster rate of decline than if you have a higher BMI. And this is despite the fact that African Americans as a group tend to have higher levels of BMI, as you may be aware with the obesity epidemic. But these data are showing us that despite the difference in BMI across race, BMI as a risk factor is operating the same in both groups. low BMI in older age is bad for you when it comes to losing your cognition. Now, we've examined other culturally relevant risk factors, such as perceived discrimination. This is a social stressor that is common among minority populations, especially African Americans. It has been shown in many studies to be associated with poor health, and some studies have found that it partially accounts for health disparities. We looked at it in our study to see if perceptions of discrimination were associated with cognition, and found that people who reported higher levels of discrimination performed more poorly on our cognitive tests, especially episodic memory and perceptual speed. In another study, we measured an abnormal protein in the blood called C-reactive protein. This is a marker that tells you how much inflammation you have in your body, and we correlated reports of discrimination with this abnormal marker, and we found that people who reported more discrimination had more of this abnormal protein in their blood. If you take these two studies together, it suggests that inflammation could be a potential pathway linking discrimination to poor cognition and other health outcomes. We've looked at a similar result in a study where we looked at brain images from participants who had done an MRI in an MRI machine. In this study, we were able to measure the neural connections between different parts of the brain, shown here in yellow. This particular network of connections is important when we are processing emotional experiences or material. And we found that this network was stronger in African Americans who had high reports of perceived discrimination compared to whites who reported perceived discrimination. Again, supporting the finding that the stress of experiencing discrimination is getting under the skin to affect not only these abnormal proteins circulating in the blood and performance on our memory tests, but it's also associated with stronger neural connections that reflect emotional processing. Another risk factor that we've looked at that is relevant to African Americans is perceived stress, which assesses the degree to which you find your life unpredictable, uncontrollable, and overloading. We found that people who reported higher levels of this tendency of perceived stress had faster rates of decline on our cognitive battery. You can see the two lines here. The really steep line are people who reported the highest level of perceived stress compared to the green line on top, people who reported lower levels. Now, we've even done something as simple as look at where people were born or where they were living at age 12 to see how that might influence performance on these cognitive tests. Here I'm showing you data from a study where we just asked people, where were you born, or where were you living at age 12? And indicated on this graph, the gray bars on top are the people who were living in the north or were born in the north, and the red bars on the bottom are people who were living in the south or born in the south. And we're plotting performance. So positive numbers are better performance, and negative numbers are worse performance. And what you can see is that the red bars on the bottom are people from the south. They're performing more poorly on our test than the people from the north. We looked at these same data in whites all the way to the right, and what you can see is the same pattern. People in the south are doing more poorly, but the difference is not as dramatic. And it suggests that that there might be something about quality of education or school experiences for African Americans who were living in the South versus those living in the North during the time that these participants would have been in elementary school, which would have been the 1920s and 1930s. Importantly, what it shows you is that the context of one's life is important in trying to understand factors that influence cognitive aging and the risk of Alzheimer's disease in different populations. So just to summarize, I want you to have 4 take-home messages from my part of the presentation. Number 1, it's important to be able to look at people over time and look at longitudinal designs when we're looking at disparities research. Number 2, we need to understand how these risk factors, which risk factors are important for risk of disease, because some conditions may be more prevalent in minority populations, like vascular conditions, and the social context of a person's life is also important. We also need to increase minority populations in clinical research in general, because African Americans tend not to be included in research studies. They need to be educated about why it's important, because the drivers of disease might be different. And finally, we need more studies with biologic outcomes. Most studies have only really talked about the differences in memory performance, and we have very limited understanding of what's underlying these memory differences. What are the biologic mechanisms driving the disparities? So the more people that we can get involved in our research, the better handle we'll have on these important issues. I will just end with the team and thank my funders and the participants of our different studies. Thank you. Andrea, your turn.
Good morning or afternoon, everybody. I'd first like to thank everyone for your interest in this webinar this morning or afternoon. I'm going to talk about a service project here in Milwaukee called United Family Caregivers. And first, I'd like to begin with a little background information about the project. United Family Caregivers is a project funded by the Administration for Community Living. It is an Alzheimer's Disease Supportive Services Program grant, and the grantee is actually the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. The intent of the grant is to provide services specifically to African American caregivers as an underserved population due to significantly lower access rates among African American caregivers to dementia-related community supports and services. The project is aligned with the Wisconsin Dementia Care System Redesign Plan. The state of Wisconsin began a dementia care system redesign several years ago following a landmark case involving a woman named Helen E.F. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about the dementia care system redesign, you can do a Google search, and that will tell you more about efforts across the state to improve both service delivery as well as the quality of life for persons with dementia and their family care partners. Initially, the project was proposed and operated in 2 Wisconsin counties simultaneously, Milwaukee and Dane County. Unfortunately, Dane County experienced a number of challenges that they were not able to overcome. At the same time, here in Milwaukee, I was receiving so many referrals that they were coming at a rate greater than I could handle all by myself. So after a while, it seemed the best way to solve this dilemma was to close the program in Dane County and move the unspent dollars to Milwaukee County, thereby allowing us to acquire an additional interventionist or caregiver support specialist. The goal of the program is to provide culturally competent intervention. Additionally, we are collecting data within the program by way of questionnaires that are presented during the assessment and the evaluation interviews with the caregivers at the beginning and end of the project. It is hoped that the aggregate responses will help us better understand and document the reasons why African American caregivers are slow to access community supports and services as compared to whites, and when they do, what works or what works best, what's most effective in reducing caregiver stress and burden, and what intervention models are most culturally appropriate. You will find that there are a number of points throughout my presentation that will emphasize or reiterate some points that Dr. Barnes made in her presentation. I'd like to begin by talking about the main goals of the project. The main goals were to increase awareness about dementia and the resources that are available here in Milwaukee to help, to reduce the stigma associated with dementia in the African American community, to improve access among African American caregivers to dementia interventions and other dementia-related supportive services, and finally to reduce caregiver stress and burden and improve caregiver well-being while supporting caregivers' goal to continue to provide care at home for as long as possible. And I'll talk more about that final point especially, which is very culturally congruent. Let me begin by talking about African Americans as a population group, both here in Milwaukee County and in the state of Wisconsin. Per U.S. Census Bureau state and county quick facts, and this is for 2014, African American population for Milwaukee was just under 30%. And I actually checked the same statistic recently, and for 2017, the estimate is exactly the same, 27.2%. The African American population increased 9.7% since the 2000 census. What's important to note here is Milwaukee County is home to nearly 70% of all of the African Americans that are living in the state of Wisconsin. It is the largest minority group in Wisconsin, and Milwaukee County, along with Dane County, represent the highest population of African Americans in the state. Dane County is our second largest. Dr. Barnes already spoke a little bit about prevalence of cognitive impairment in communities of color, so this graph reiterates what she said. Studies show that African Americans are approximately 2 times more likely to have dementia than are whites. Latinos are 1.5 times more likely. In addition, onset for both of these groups is at a younger age than it is for whites. What this means is that African Americans are less likely to have a formal diagnosis. Compounding that situation is that they are less informed about the disease. There's a significantly lower level of awareness about what dementia is, what are the signs and symptoms, what are the risk factors, and the fact that dementia is not a normal part of the aging process. Because they are less likely to have a formal diagnosis, they are less likely to be followed by and receive appropriate treatment from the medical community, and are less likely to receive the needed support from the social service community. Due to the higher level of stigma attached to the disease, it's important to, as you're speaking to members of the community, you want to try and avoid using terms like Alzheimer's or dementia. So when I'm doing community presentations or just speaking to families in their home, instead, at least in the beginning, I try to use terms like brain health, or I talk about memory issues or memory impairment. In that way, I can capture their attention and provide education around brain health, Alzheimer's, and dementia. In addition, I provide education around the signs and symptoms, risk factors, most importantly, what are the modifiable risk factors, as well as what are the community supports and services. And then the most important point, the importance of accessing community resources as soon as possible for the best outcomes for both the loved one and the loved one with dementia, as well as the family care partners. This next slide talks about some of the challenges that African Americans face with the modern healthcare systems, and this also accounts for reasons why there are lower rates of access among African Americans. As Dr. Barnes already stated, there are inequities and health disparities across the lifespan for African Americans. Many of these disparities include chronic conditions that significantly increase the risk for dementia, such as diabetes, heart disease, respiratory illnesses, and chronic health conditions otherwise like cholesterol and What was interesting to me is the role that BMI played. That is actually new information for me. But we also know that long-term exposure to chronic stress is a significant factor increasing risk to dementia and other diseases. There is also a fear and distrust of the modern healthcare system and to interventions due to a history of abusive practices. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time, but I just want to point out a couple of cases because we tend to think that these abusive practices happened a long time ago. Many of you may be aware of the Tuskegee experiment, which was an experiment that lasted for a 40-year period between 1932 and 1972. 1972 was only 46 years ago. In addition, most of us are familiar with the case involving Henrietta Lacks. And if you're interested in more information about this, there's a great book that I'd like to recommend called Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington. But there's a great deal of stigma and a higher level of stigma around dementia for communities of color. We often talk in African American communities about being in our right mind. And in fact, when we count our blessings, we often give thanks to God for being in our right mind. Therefore, dementia is equated with not being in your right mind, or often being crazy or having mental illness. There are also cultural differences in the beliefs and values as well as expectations around caregiving. And this is actually very powerful in terms of its role in inhibiting African American caregivers for reaching out for help. We tend to view caregiving as a way of honoring our elders, of giving back, of making sacrifices to those, particularly our parents or grandparents, who made sacrifices to us in raising us. It's also a way of showing respect. In addition, there are cultural values around privacy, not putting our business in the street, around pride, as well as self-sufficiency. And just to share a little story, very early in this project, I met a family who specifically forbade me of reaching out to an additional support in the community because she knew that the representative that represented that resource was a member of her church, and she did not want anyone else in her church to know about her husband's condition. So I'd now like to spend more time talking about United Family Caregivers in detail. United Family Caregivers as a project, the original grant provided for the option of an intervention, and one of two intervention models were offered. The first one, MCC, which stands for Memory Care Connections, is actually a intervention. It's an evidence-based intervention developed by Dr. Mary Middleman, and it's based on the New York University Caregiver Intervention Model. In her intervention, this model was created specifically for spouses or partners where one spouse or partner has the diagnosis and the other one is the caregiver. The backbone of this intervention model is working with the primary caregiver, the spouse or partner, to identify goals and then working with them and facilitating generally four family meetings and soliciting support from the family unit to support the spouse or partner who is caring for their loved one. The other intervention model that we used is called the UCC model. It's based on a model that was previously used and tested by United Community Center in a project by the same name, actually, the Latino Cuidadores project. This model is adapted from the IMPACT model. IMPACT being, it stands for Improving Mood and Promoting Access to Collaborative Treatment. In this model, the backbone is two elements. One is behavioral activation, where you work with the caregiver to promote the inclusion of pleasurable activities in their daily and weekly schedule. And then the other element is problem-solving treatment. So basically, you work with the caregiver to identify a number of challenges, and then you problem solve around each of these challenges. The intervention was offered as an option. You didn't have to do an intervention, but all of the caregivers that were served under this project received education, resource referral, and assistance with short and long-term care planning, as well as ongoing support. You will notice that much of what I will say today is caregiver focused because that was the focus of our project. However, in an expansion grant that was just introduced a year ago, 3 additional elements became available. The friendly visitor is the one that I'll speak most about. The friendly visitor is an individual. One of the things that I noted as I began serving families, and I have a colleague here in the Department on Aging who had been in his role for some time, and he does similar work with the Dementia Redesign Plan for the state. So he was a state-sponsored dementia care specialist. And as our program launched, I shadowed him with his work with families. And all of the families that I had an opportunity to witness were white. And we would arrive at the home. The primary caregiver would meet and greet us, sometimes introduce us to their spouse. And in his case, he was pretty much only working with spouses or partners because he was using the MCC model, the New York University Caregiver Intervention model. And then we'd sit in a room in the home, and the person with dementia was never present. So when I began my work expecting similar, I arrived at the home of my first family. Introductions took place, including an introduction to the person with dementia, and then we all sat down in the living room. And I'm looking at the family, waiting for them to, escort the person with dementia out of the room, and they're all looking at me, waiting to begin. So I quickly realized that this was a difference, and this pattern was repeated over and over again in families that I'm serving, that frequently the person with dementia would be present and would often participate in the conversations with the caregivers. Additionally, it became very difficult to identify exactly who. It was difficult to single out a primary caregiver because frequently the care burden was shared by 2 or more members of the family. So even the introductory meeting would often be with, 4 or more members of the family unit who were all taking a share in the caregiving load. The downside of that is that it would make it difficult for caregivers to be as candid and straightforward as was necessary. So the friendly visitor is an individual who would go with the interventionist, and while I'm having a conversation with the caregiver or caregivers, the friendly visitor is interacting with the person with dementia. In addition, the friendly visitor is allowed to provide respite, companionship care to the family at times when I am not there, thereby allowing the family to experience respite free of charge, and then experience its benefits as a way of introducing this to your set of resources. Music and memory is another evidence-based intervention that is made available through the expansion grant, and that is a program where we're providing devices and headsets with customized playlists to families that are being served by this grant, as well as families outside of this grant, this project rather, United Family Caregivers. And then finally, respite. Respite is over and above what the friendly visitor is providing. So this, in this case, it can include personal care. It can include assistance with medications, whatever additional respite services are needed by that caregiver. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on data collection, but the purpose of the data collection is to enable us to do a comparison of the efficacy of the two evidence-based intervention models that we are using, and to document what cultural adaptations are necessary within each of these models. In addition, we have a questionnaire that will help us understand what factors play a role in facilitating or inhibiting African Americans from accessing community supports and services, and then finally to measure the impact of the provision of respite and in particular the companionship care provided by the friendly visitor on quality of life and caregiver stress. These are the outcomes of our project to date, and we are, the grant is a 3-year grant, so we are actually in the final months of our project. In terms of the intervention, we have had approximately 45 participants enroll in either the MCC or the UCC intervention. Both of these are evidence-based interventions. The usual length of participation for our participants is approximately 6 months compared to a 4-month average for both the NYUCI model as well as the impact model on which these two intervention models are based. However, more than 350 families and caregivers have been touched by the program in terms of the delivery of information, education, support, and services. And our outreach activities have touched more than 1,500 people across our county, both members of the African American community, which is the largest portion of that number, but also other service providers in the community, social workers and clinicians at clinics, hospitals, and memory diagnostic clinics, which accounted for the majority of our referrals initially. I also want to talk about some of the measurable outcomes based on the evaluation tools that are a part of this project. We are using the ZERT Caregiver Burden tool, and the portion of this tool that measures emotional stress, at baseline, the mean is 26.75. Follow-up, the mean is 22.91. And that represents a reduction of nearly 4 points. For the total ZERT, there's a reduction of 3.5 points. The PHQ-9, which is a depression measuring tool, our baseline mean is 18.33. Our follow-up mean, 12.56, a reduction of nearly 6 points. And finally, our quality of life measure, and this quality of life measure was taken directly out of the NYUCI model, shows an overall increase of nearly 10 points. And this is all caregiver self-reports. I'd like to spend a few moments talking about the caregiver experience, and a lot of this is by way of experience. We are still compiling the data from our questionnaires. However, based on my experience and the conversations that I've had with the 350 or so caregivers, the first and primary reason that they are all reporting for not reaching out for help sooner is the lack of awareness that the community supports and services even existed. I can't tell you how many times I heard them say, if only I'd known about this sooner. Above and beyond that, though, there's also a lack of awareness about dementia as a neurological disorder and that it's not a part of the normal aging process. As I mentioned earlier, there is a strong value around privacy and not wanting anyone else to know about what you're dealing with. Also, as I mentioned earlier, a desire to honor our elders. And this is expressed both as, you know, it's a way of expressing gratitude for the sacrifices that they've made, but it's also expressed as respect. In the families that I was serving, the majority of the caregivers were the adult children of the person with dementia. So one of the challenges that we faced is the challenge of wanting to have your parents' permission or consent before accessing the resource. Finally, a belief that care demands can be handled on their own, and then a belief that the resource was not for us. And by that, many of our the persons with dementia, and in some cases their caregivers, come from a generation that unless that resource was developed within and by the African American community, there's no expectation that they should be served by it. Again, for those who are from the South, they were well aware that that resource was not intended to serve them.
So,
and
Andrea,
as I wrap,
we're going to need to move to questions if you want to wrap up in the next minute or so.
Okay. I want to wrap up by just stating the importance of establishing a relationship and building trust. It's important to be authentic. You don't have to know all of the answers. Treat your families with respect. Understand that they are the experts in their situation. And then finally, let them tell you what it is that they want out of the relationship and out of the intervention. And then show them how the intervention can provide what they are looking for. A few cultural tendencies as it pertains to caregiving. As I mentioned, it's often a family affair. It is not uncommon to have several family members involved in providing care. And then my third point, just some buzzwords that you want to try to avoid so that you don't turn them off before you have an opportunity to build that trust. Finally, placement. It's not for everyone. It is definitely viewed as an ultimate last resort among African Americans, and so it's probably not a good idea to start talking about placement until you've established that relationship of trust. And at this point, we can go on to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, both Lisa and Andrea, for your great presentations. Everyone can continue to enter their questions into the question and answer chat pod that you see on your screen. Quite a few questions have come in, so we can start getting those answered. The first question that I have for you, Lisa, is someone has asked if your research results support the statement that African Americans are 2 times as likely as whites to develop Alzheimer's disease, to see if your research is supportive of that fact.
That's a great question. It depends. So if you think about Alzheimer's as a level diagnosis, so people take these tests and then they score at a certain point, and if they are impaired, it comes up as Alzheimer's. If you look at it as a level diagnosis, then yes, our results are consistent with that because we are finding that African Americans perform more poorly. But if you follow people over time, that's where there's some kind of a discrepancy. We're not seeing faster rates of decline that you would expect if African Americans were more at risk than whites. And what it suggests is that we need to look further at things beyond cognition. Maybe we need to look in the brain, either through imaging or in autopsy studies, to see if we can see the characteristic changes of Alzheimer's disease and see if those are different by race. But just on the face of cognition by itself, we do see these level differences, but we don't see change over time. So it's still a bit of a mystery.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for responding to that question. We did have a question come in also, Lisa, for if you could please explain what life space refers to and what neighborhood social disorder refers to.
Okay, so life space is a concept that we got from the University of Alabama that they use in their mobility research. And basically it's just a questionnaire that asks the participant how far they venture from their base in their home. So we ask just a question about how often do you leave your bedroom? How often do you leave your house? How often do you leave your front porch? And the circles keep getting bigger and bigger until the last question is how often do you leave your city, I think is the last question. And so we found that people who reported a bigger life space had a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. They were protected. So it's something about maybe interacting with the world or just having a more extensive network of people and things that get you outside of your home, your bed. The neighborhood social disorder was another questionnaire where we ask about objective measures in the community, things like how much crime, how much cohesion exists between neighbors, the amount of lighting, the ability to walk, without being obstructed, and in the sidewalks, the walkability of a neighborhood. We made a measure, put all these things together, and the higher your social disorder in the neighborhood, the more of a risk it was for the disease.
Great, thank you. So a question for both of you, Andrea and then Lisa. Can you talk about any similar community-based interventions that you know of or research studies that look at similar issues in the Latino population, if you know of any?
This is Andrea speaking, and yes, here in Milwaukee, there was a similar project, which I mentioned, the Cuidadores Unidos project, that was conducted by the United Community Center. And they are a partner on my project, and one of the intervention models that we are using with the African American population was used in their Cuidadores Unidos project, and that is the one that's referred to as the UCC model based on the impact model.
And for my answer, we have a Latino core that we just got funded last year that's very similar to the MARS study in that we enroll older Latinos in the Chicago area without dementia, follow them over time, and we give them, a battery of risk factors and cognitive function tests, and we're trying to also recruit for brain autopsy in that study. That study is very new, though, so we don't have a lot of data. We have about maybe 150 Latinos enrolled to date, and our goal is to get 300 that will follow over time. The person who leads that study is David Marquez. He's a kinesiologist, and he also has a salsa intervention in older Latinos to see if salsa dancing is protective against cognitive decline. And then I have another colleague here at Rush who will be, who's trying to get funded to do a physical activity intervention in Latinos. Because Chicago has a very high percentage of Latinos, and so it's a really good area for us to do this kind of research, and they are really underrepresented when it comes to studies of aging.
Great, thank you. So that's about all the time we have for today. We do have another webinar scheduled for August 7th. Please join us. You can sign up at ASA's website. And I will just turn it over to Steve Morse for some final comments.